Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, a podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. Siobhan Huggins is an outstanding citizen scientist who uses her engineering and systems background to break down interesting problems and synthesize the latest science. She's done extensive work in how lipids impact the immune system and chronic diseases. She's personally lost over 65 pounds on keto carnivore, reversed hypertension, and normalized her blood sugars. She currently collaborates with Dave Feldman, a fellow citizen scientist and self-experimenter, famous for his work in exposing myths about cholesterol and explaining the deep science behind it. Welcome to the show, Siobhan.
Real quick, 3 points.
Sure. Yeah, please.
So I don't actually have an engineering background.
Okay.
I
just an engineering mind.
I guess. My grandfather worked at NASA as an engineer, if that counts.
Wow.
So I used to work on at an IT help desk. So it's not quite engineering, but it's kind of techie. And then the other thing is it's now up to 80 pounds.
Congrats. Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. I think it went up to 80. I think it's more like 75-ish because I gained some and then lost some of it again. And then it's not to be nitpicky, but I know other people will yell at you if I don't. But it's Siobhan. So it's like SH and then BH is V.
Oh, thank you.
Irish people hate me.
Siobhan. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's very important. I would have pronounced it incorrectly the entire episode. So thank you.
I'm kind of used to it at this point. I think the only person who has actually looked at how it's spelled and was like, oh yeah, you're Siobhan, was actually Ivor Cummins, and he's Irish.
Oh, cool. Well, I get the same thing all the time with my last name. So completely fine. So Siobhan, would love to just start with sort of your story personally. What brought you to keto, and why were you interested in the first place?
So I kind of had a long off and on again relationship with calorie restriction. And I'm very much like an on or off person. So there was no moderation in that. So a lot of the time it was 800 calories a day until I literally could not stand it anymore. And that amounted to no weight loss pretty much any of the times that I tried it. It did leave me with a lot of really bad mood swings that unfortunately my boyfriend had to put up with a lot of the time. And I had walked into my mom's kind of study area and told her I wanted to try calorie restriction again. And she was actually the one who suggested keto because she had been researching it and had been doing sort of like a paleo type of thing for a while. And so she suggested we try it together. And I kind of brushed it off, but I looked into it for myself and found that, yeah, there does appear to be some scientific backing. And so I decided that I would go ahead and try it for 2 months. And if it didn't work, then I'd be no worse off than I was before. And so I just went all out. I figured out how to count carbs and all that type of stuff. And by the end of the 2 months, I think I had lost 20 pounds. So at that point, I was like, well, I guess this is what I'm sticking with from now on.
Yeah, that's excellent. And really remarkable how you've continued to progress on it. Do you want to talk about sort of how that evolved into carnivore afterwards?
Yeah, so a lot of things actually started back at the first Keto Fest, which was held by the two keto dudes who also have a podcast. And I was volunteering as an admin on the ketogenic forums, which they also run. And since I decided I wanted to go to Keto Fest, I worked as staff there. And while I was there, I ended up running into Dave for the first time in person. And I also ended up watching Amber O'Hearn's talk, and she was talking about carnivore. And she gave a lot of really interesting information that kind of left me with, well, I guess I don't really need vegetables, so I'll only really eat the ones that I really, really want to have. And over time, that progressed to pretty much 5 days out of the week, I was eating carnivore. Usually it was like chicken thighs with Kerrygold butter or something like that. And this was while I was still working the IT job. So I was struggling because I felt like I needed something to think about while at work that wasn't work related. So something I could think about while on hold with a client or something like that. And so I decided I would go full out carnivore as an experiment. And Dave was for it. He was interested in the data. And unfortunately, I went right into it. So I don't have baseline data, which is like the biggest mistake ever. I did have labs from right before Keto Fest, so a couple months ago. But I just went ahead and went for it. Mostly I was eating pork and chicken just because that's what I was craving. And I had decided from the very outset that I wasn't going to eat something just because I felt like I had to, like organ meats. I would essentially be following an ad libitum carnivorous diet. So anything I was craving that came from an animal, whether that was dairy or organs or meat, whatever kind, I would go ahead and eat it until I was full. And that's essentially what I've been doing for almost a year now.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. And Siobhan, I heard your podcast with Dr. Brett Scher on the Low Carb Cardiologist podcast, which was a great one. He's a past guest of the show. And you talked there a bit about some of the mental or emotional benefits you experienced as a transition to keto and carnivore, and how some of that sort of tied in with Keto Fest and that whole journey. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. So essentially, I guess I was never diagnosed because I never saw a therapist. But I highly suspect I had essentially chronic depression. And it was really bad for a long time. And it essentially stayed that way until I went keto, where it wasn't an immediate change. But I remember at one point, a couple months in, I was sitting in the parking lot of a store and I was trying to figure out what exactly I was feeling. And I realized I felt happy. And I hadn't really felt just like totally content and happy for any time that I can remember, really. And so keto definitely helped with that. And what I found interesting is that when I went carnivore, I started having almost like depressive episodes again. And I couldn't figure out what it was for a long time until I just kept trying to pay attention to when it was happening. And I realized that it was pretty consistent that if I had like leg cramps immediately the day before, and then the next day I would have this encounter with depression again, seemingly randomly. And I started to suspect it was magnesium. And after that, I really, really upped my magnesium and they went away. And as long as I kept supplementing, they stayed away. And now I don't need that extra magnesium anymore. So I think it was more of a transition thing where it was just a hard switch or I wasn't getting enough from something. So I needed to supplement a little until I was more into it. But then after that, my mood has been good. I think there are still some things that need to be ironed out, but for the most part, it's nothing at all like it used to be on a standard American diet. And I can absolutely confirm for me, at the very least, that diet is a huge component of my mood because there have been cases where I've eaten something and realized later it had sugar in it. And it just brings it right back to where I was. And it's not pleasant. And I'm very happy to be away from that. So that's a big motivator for me to stay carnivore or keto or anything that's not like the standard American diet.
Wow, that's remarkable. Thank you for sharing that. I can't imagine how much of a relief that must have been, and just your story talking about feeling truly happy for the first time in a long time is really powerful. And Siobhan, can you talk a little bit now that you've spent more time carnivore, some of the experiments you've done around it and how that ties into your work around cholesterol with Dave?
Yeah, so one of the big things is that I got my lipoprotein(a) tested, which for people who aren't aware, it's more of the up and coming, like newly in the spotlight lipoprotein. It's very similar to LDL, except it has another little tag on it. And high levels are associated with cardiovascular disease. So obviously, with my high level, I was concerned. And granted, part of it can be genetic, but I'm also very stubborn. And so it was kind of doubting it, especially because I got my sister tested and her levels were like way lower. So some people on Twitter had been saying, maybe it's the pork, because what I was eating was primarily pork, like I said before. And some people made the point that it could have a higher level of omega-6, and that could be increasing inflammation and oxidative stress and all that type of thing. And part of Lp(a)'s job is to clean up the damage from that. So I finally said, okay, fine. I will switch to beef for a while and see if anything happens. And so I did essentially a week of pastured pork from a local farm, and then a week of store-bought pork, and a week of just store-bought beef, and then a week of grass-finished beef also from the same farm. And I had called them to confirm that they weren't feeding them grains, they weren't feeding them corn, it was just pastured. And when I switched over to beef, and this was going from the pastured pork to the just store-bought beef, my Lp(a) dropped. I was like, oh no, maybe they were right. And so my first suspicion was maybe it was the fatty acid profile, but with recent data that I've had, I'm starting to suspect that's not actually the case. There are some studies that say that ingested L-carnitine, for example, can lower Lp(a), and red meat has much higher levels than pork. So one of the things I want to do next is just test that directly by supplementing it while eating pork. But I haven't gotten to that point yet. But just recently, I did do a test where I was eating a ketogenic shake, so high fat, low carb, and the base for it was heavy whipping cream. So that is high saturated fat. So I had that at baseline levels, and then I did a high calorie phase, and it was the same shake, but instead of like the 99 mil of heavy cream, it was like 270, and I was having 6 of those a day. So over a liter of heavy cream and a lot, I think nearly like a pound of saturated fat in total or something like that. So the baseline, which is what I was kind of curious about for that one, the baseline Lp(a) was actually a little bit higher than it normally is. And granted, the fat intake on that was probably a little lower than my normal, but it kind of suggests to me that it's not actually the saturated fat that's lowering it in the case of the beef versus pork. Granted, it's not a 1-to-1, but I would expect it would be lower than usual if it actually were the saturated fat levels affecting it, which pushes me towards the idea that it might actually be the L-carnitine thing, in which case I don't know if I care that much. And before I did that one, I also had another one where I did the Feldman protocol, and we called it like the mega monster Feldman protocol because instead of the 10.5 day, I ended up doing 12.5 because the LabCorp near me wasn't open on weekends, so I had to adjust. So I did 7 days of fasting with 3 blood tests throughout, and then I did an additional 5 days of high calorie. And what we found was that while I was doing that multi-day fasting, my Lp(a) went up from my baseline. And then when I did the high calorie, which was around 3,000 calories a day of cheese and processed meat, it went down to the lowest level I've ever seen it. which actually suggests it may be following the inversion pattern, just like Dave has shown in his work, where if you fast or do low calorie for 3 or so days and then do a high calorie, high fat phase for 3 days, initially LDL will go up and then it'll rock bottom. So it seems almost like Lp(a) is doing the same exact thing, which is somewhat odd because a lot of the research suggests that it's pretty much determined genetically. It can shift a little bit as an acute phase reactant. So if you're majorly sick or something like that, it'll skyrocket. But other than that, it's pretty stable. But from the 2 experiments I've done around it, as far as manipulating energy, it does seem to be just as dynamic as LDL, to the point where with the most recent one I was talking about earlier, where I did the baseline calories and then the high calorie, I was doing about 6,000 calories a day for the last 2 days or so. And the Lp(a) went from like 180 down to maybe like 50 or 60 or something like that, maybe 65. Really, really low, like normal. Just consider like if someone saw the ladder test in isolation, they would just be like, oh, this is normal. So I find that pretty interesting because, again, it's another case of this is far more dynamic than we think it is. So then it brings up the question of, well, are high levels always bad? Or like LDL, could it possibly be context specific? And that's something that I'm interested in finding out for sure.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I hadn't heard of that type of work being done with Lp(a), so that's really remarkable. And just for folks listening who may not be as familiar with Dave and his protocol and his work, I'm going to make sort of a broad generalized statement to introduce it, and then you can correct me, Siobhan, if anything I'm saying is out of line. But I really love your work and his work because essentially, from what I can see, what you're doing is you're taking theories around cholesterol and lipidology and applying a theory, running a very controlled, short N=1 or sometimes N=2 experiment to see how blood values of cholesterol can be manipulated through changes in diet. And a lot of it is showing how cholesterol values and numbers that doctors rely on so heavily are extremely transient. Is that fair to say at a high level?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. It's definitely far more dynamic than I think a lot of doctors realize, let alone the patients. And we do have several people who come to the site and they want our opinion for whatever reason, although we are not doctors. And we sometimes have people, in particular carnivores actually, who come to us with really weird levels. And if you poke around a little bit, you can find 1 or 2 things that influenced it, like they didn't fast long enough, or they didn't fast at all before the blood test, or they decided to do a 2-day fast before they got the blood draw, and that can really mess up your numbers. But a doctor might suspect it wouldn't do anything because these are markers that are not really supposed to change until, 3 or 6 months out. So if, for example, I did a blood draw and I was drinking, let's say, a lot of coffee as a carnivore or a low carber, and I got a blood draw done and my triglycerides came back at, say, 600, which is something I've seen before, you can kind of start going down a list of questions like, how long did you fast before the test? 12 to 14 hours? Okay, not that. Are you consuming liquid fats? That's something we see occasionally, especially if it's coconut oil or MCT oil. And then the other thing is if they drink coffee on the morning of the test, or if they drink it a lot, just in general, sometimes that appears to be causing a problem, not for everybody, but for some people. And in the case of the 600 milligrams per deciliter in triglycerides, which, by the way, is really, really high, they cut back from, I think it was like 6 espressos a day to like 2 espressos a day or something like that. And it dropped by 400 points.
So in that case, is coffee actually causing that associated level of harm in the body, or is it just throwing off the test kind of arbitrarily?
We're not really sure because the problem is there's not really any large study that's looking at people who are having this reaction. And it seems to me, at the very least, that the lower carb you go, the more of a reaction you can have to it. I've actually seen someone who is coming from keto to carnivore, and their keto triglycerides were already a little bit elevated, even though they had done everything right except for the coffee, and then they go carnivore and boom, it doubles. So I think that's probably why there's not a lot of study on it, because if you're eating the standard American diet, there may just be too much other noise or too much of a buffer from something, so it doesn't even show up.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
But there are some studies showing that coffee, or caffeine in particular, does increase the trafficking of fat. So from your fat cells to the liver, in the lipoproteins out, and then just keeping that circulation going at a higher level. So that may be what it is. And if that's the case, is it harmful? We don't really know, because usually with high triglycerides, what the issue is it's a sign of hyperinsulinemia or pathological insulin resistance. But with the case of coffee, if they have insulin tested, it's usually normal and everything else looks fine. So currently it's a big question mark, and we pretty much, like, if I had that result, I would personally choose to stay away from coffee. But at this point, it's more of an individual choice because we don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I can imagine how it would be somewhat alarming for someone to see that on a test. And can you talk about some of the other results you've seen from or heard from patients going carnivore, showing, high cholesterol numbers, and how you would sort of think about that in that context?
Yeah, so typically, I mean, sometimes there's not really much of a change, or there's a change in HSCRP, for example, which is a inflammatory marker. Usually that goes down, except for the weird triglyceride thing, which pops up occasionally. Sometimes their triglycerides will drop. Their LDL may go higher. And that, I would suspect, is probably just because they're relying even more on fat, or maybe they dropped a little bit of weight when they went carnivore. And so they're trending more towards what Dave calls the lean mass hyperresponder, which is essentially someone who's very lean or active. And for women, this doesn't have to be like stick thin. I've seen women with like a 23% body fat who has this profile where it's generally LDL of 200 or higher, HDL of 70 or higher, and then triglycerides of 80 or lower. The triglycerides and HDL may be reversed. I don't remember. I haven't looked at it in a while. But essentially, it's someone who has really high LDL, really high HDL, but really, really low triglycerides. And the current working theory is essentially they're just running really, really efficiently on fat, because there are lipoproteins called VLDL, which are shipped out from the liver. And these carry triglycerides, which are the fat-based energy. And these are kind of counterbalanced by chylomicrons, which are these really, really big guys who carry around fat that you've just eaten from the gut. And so these two are kind of on a seesaw where it's trying to get you the energy that you need on a high-fat diet that you're relying on. So if you eat more dietary fat, not so much being shipped out from your stores that's sent out in the VLDL is needed, so that goes a little bit lower. Or if you're fasting or low calorie, or you don't have as much body fat, because with body fat, you can supply a little bit of energy directly to the muscle right next to the fat store. So if you don't have as much fat, you can't do that as much. So you need more global supply. And that's the VLDL. So with the lean mass hyperresponder, they don't have a lot of body fat, but they're still relying quite a lot on that VLDL, because the cells need energy or they will die. And sugar is just not an option, because that's being spared for the brain, for the red blood cells, all that type of stuff. So what you have is someone who's shipping out a whole bunch of these VLDL guys, and they're dropping off the energy really, really quick because it's needed. It's being used up quickly. And when VLDL drops off that cargo, it goes to IDL, which is an intermediate form, and then some of that is eventually moved off to LDL, so transformed or modified into LDL. So in that case, you would have someone with low VLDL because they're moving through them very rapidly, high LDL, like the 200 or above that we usually see, high HDL as well, so low inflammation, low insulin, that type of thing. And then the very low triglycerides because they're using them. So I think I tend to see that with carnivores, especially if they're coming from keto, if they've lost weight, for example, or they're just relying more on fat because primary use.
That's interesting. And that's been fairly close to what I've seen in my blood lipids the last few months or year or so. I've been carnivore for almost 2 years, and my triglycerides are about 40. My HDL is about low 70s. And then I think my LDL and total cholesterol were both either at the high end of the quote unquote range or a little bit above. And then my VLDL was like 9, which is apparently totally fine.
Right.
So kind of mirrors what you're talking about in a typical carnivore. And can you talk, Siobhan, a little bit more about your work with Dave on cholesterol code? It's cholesterolcode.com is the URL, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Can you talk a little bit about some of the topics you've explored more deeply, such as lipids in the immune system?
Yeah. So a lot of what Dave has focused on up to this point has been the energy distribution side of things. And meanwhile, I have found a huge fascination with how LDL is used in the immune system to fight infection, possibly to fight oxidative stress, and also just repair in general, because LDL does carry cholesterol. That's kind of what it's known for. And the shell that's surrounding the cholesterol is made of phospholipid and free cholesterol and all that type of stuff. And that is made of what cell membranes are made of. So cells have something called an LDL receptor. So if they get injured, then they can put out that LDL receptor, a whole bunch of them, and it forms this pit. And they can essentially swallow an LDL particle whole and use the materials to patch themselves up, essentially, possibly saving themselves a little bit of energy from having to synthesize the cholesterol themselves. So that part alone is just fascinating. But then you also have things like LDL and actually quite a lot of the different lipoproteins like chylomicrons and VLDL and HDL, even lipoprotein a can bind to pathogens. And they can essentially neutralize them and ship them off to immune cells so they can be put out of commission, so they can't harm anything in our body. So if you just imagine how many LDL particles we actually have, which is in like the quintillions,
wow,
then you can really kind of understand how this could be helpful for the immune system, because you essentially just have this passive barrier where if it encounters a pathogen, it's going to bind to it and then it can just get rid of it before it can do anything really. And then you also have HDL, which is supremely complicated. And it's kind of sad because in a lot of the research, it's really only talked about in terms of reverse cholesterol transport. So let's say a cell has too much cholesterol, and so it effluxes it out. It kind of spits it back out to HDL so it can go back to the liver for recycling or just to be trashed if you don't need it. But the fact of the matter is that HDL has like over 200 or something different proteins, a lot of which we don't even really know what they do. But some of them have like regulatory impact on inflammation and oxidation, antioxidants, helping to make sure that LDL doesn't get oxidized, potentially unless it needs to be, like just a vast amount of things, including in the immune system. And you can actually see this if you get sick. I have, because I'm special and I've gotten sick like a total of 3 times or something. And every single time I go get blood work done.
Wow.
And pretty much every single time I'll see ferritin will go up. Ferritin is an acute phase reactant. So when things are going bad, it goes up. HSCRP will go up. At one point, it was like 48. Normal is under 3. So kind of went back up. And then as soon as I got better, it was back to normal. LDL particle count went up. LDL-C went up. And if you look at the LDL-C versus LDL-P, sometimes what they'll talk about is discordance. So you'll have an abnormally low amount of LDL-C compared to the actual particle count. So a low amount of cargo compared to how many particles you have. And I did, for the times that I could measure, because sometimes I actually break the test and it will just tell me it's over a certain amount. But for the times that I can actually calculate it, the discordance does appear to get worse if I'm sick, which makes sense because it ties into all these immune processes and stuff like that. HDL typically goes down, triglycerides typically go up, and then as soon as I get better, it shifts back into normal. And another thing that goes up is actually lipoprotein(a) as well. When I get sick, it tends to track with CRP, the inflammatory marker, and ferritin, another acute phase reactant. So it kind of it travels with them for the ups and downs for infection so far.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And is the spike in LDL, is that related to and how it ties in with antioxidants, the scavenger LDL?
I suspect. So I can't 100% confirm, but there actually is a paper that says that along with binding to pathogens and things like that, that it's plausible that LDL could be used as essentially an endogenous antioxidant because it does carry alpha tocopherol, which is a type of vitamin E, which is an antioxidant. And the other thing is if its phospholipid shell gets oxidized, it can cleave those parts off, and then Lp(a) will pick them up and then essentially break them down so they can't spread chain reaction damage everywhere. And in that case, the LDL being oxidized could arguably be a better scenario than if you didn't have LDL. And because essentially the way to think about it is if LDL isn't getting oxidized when you have an infection or any time else, then what is? And the answer would obviously be everything else. So yeah, I think it is related to antioxidant properties of LDL or just pathogen binding. I think there are solid cases to be made of both.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And it's so funny. Every time I hear you or Dave speak, it's like, oh, there's another reason you shouldn't be worried about a random high LDL number on a blood test. There's so much context around it. And you can never take one test in isolation. It just seems more and more important to think about the different mechanisms that could be causing a high value, be it, your diet over the last 3 days or, your coffee consumption or you recently had a cold or a million other things that it seems like can change these tests that so many doctors rely on and then just will make a blanket prescription for almost indefinite amount of time.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. One marker out of context is often very, very misleading. There are some that are kind of better than others, but honestly, why even do that? I mean, when you're getting a lab test, a lot of the time you're getting a whole bunch of tests already. So why not just look at all of them and try to really understand what the context is? Is the context of high triglycerides the same in the case of a high HDL level where the person isn't drinking alcohol every single day or very often? If their insulin is low, if everything else looks fine, in that case, is it possible that it's something like coffee drinking? In a lot of the cases I've seen, yeah, that can be the case, or they just weren't fasting properly. But by looking at the big picture of things, by looking at HDL and triglycerides and fasting insulin and all this type of stuff, you can get a much better picture of what's going on. And granted, it's insanely complicated, but even with just that info, if I had to pick any, a lipid panel, an NMR, fasting insulin, CRP. Even with just that information, I can get a pretty good picture of how I'm doing. So,
Yeah.
why not just go for the big picture?
Yeah, that's a really helpful, practical takeaway for folks. And Siobhan, would love to just ask you a few more questions about your personal diet. I know I asked folks for questions, and you were able to get some on Facebook as well. So I'd love to just ask a little bit about, what does a day of eating sort of look like for you when you're not doing a cholesterol experiment? And we can go from there.
Yeah, so I tend to still just follow my cravings. So I haven't had pork in a while, actually, just because I haven't really wanted it. A lot of the time, since it's a bit colder now, I've been making like a carnivore stew. So I'm essentially putting chuck roast in with a bit of lamb or chicken broth that my dad had made a while ago and stuck in the freezer. And then just adding a little bit of salt to that. And what I especially like to do with that is I'll get another cut of beef with bone in that has marrow, chuck it all in the digital pressure cooker that we have, and the marrow will essentially melt into the broth, make it really, really fatty and nice, which I like a lot. Or a lot of what I've been eating lately has actually been really, really lean chicken breast with ghee. I would usually eat it with cream cheese, but I'm kind of trialing really a limited amount of dairy, just to switch things up a bit and see if I have any dairy issues, as is kind of somewhat common for some people. And that's really good. But a lot of the time it's lean meat and some dairy source of fat, just because I don't actually like the texture of fat on meat if it's cooked. It grosses me out. I don't know why. But it does. And so essentially my only options are like lean meat with an outside source of fat or raw meat, which I'm fine with, but my mom hasn't slaughtered a lamb recently, and that's the only place I would feel comfortable getting and eating raw meat.
Yeah, that's interesting. I always find it so fascinating, folks who say they really don't like the taste of cooked fat. It must make carnivore substantially more difficult, but ghee is delicious. So I'm definitely with you there.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly not too bad. It's mostly just the texture of the liquid fat that bothers me. But I figure at some point I'll just trial transitioning to like just raw meat only, because I have done that like for a couple meals before, and I honestly prefer it to cooked beef. A big reason I don't eat more beef is because I don't like the taste of it cooked. So raw beef and raw lamb, I mean, I would be up for that.
Yeah, that sounds delicious. And was curious to know. You mentioned at the start of the interview that you always said you were going to eat sort of intuitively and not eat things that you weren't craving. Are you still doing that? How do you find your appetite has been on carnivore in terms of the amount you eat, and if you're targeting a certain protein percent or something like that, or are you still trying to keep it very intuitive?
Yeah, so I'm still pretty much doing intuitive unless I'm in the middle of an experiment where it has to be tightly controlled. I just eat whatever I want to eat until I'm full, pretty much, which is usually like one meal a day. I did find at the really, really far beginning, when I was just getting started, that I was hungry far more often than was usual for me. But now it's kind of back to the 1 or 2 meals a day, and that pretty much gets me through it. As far as protein, I don't target anything specifically so far. I haven't found a need to. Um, I do track my food, and when I've kind of looked back over what I've been eating, it almost always averages out to like exactly 30% of calories from protein, and then the rest is fat or like 5 carbs if I'm eating dairy. So I find that kind of interesting, that just by eating what my brain is telling me to eat, it's almost always like 30% protein every single time. Um, yeah, so I found that fine. I know there are some people who have issues with high protein on carnivore. I think especially like diabetics can have some issues. Ben Bickman mentioned in his talk from low carb Breckenridge of this year, I think, that the glycemic response to protein may be a little bit different depending on your current glycemic status. So if you're hyperglycemic, you might have a different response to it. But I don't know if that's true, but at the very least, I have seen other people have had issues and do need to limit. I have also noticed that if I do not eat enough protein, I start craving really, really lean meat. Like it gets really bad. And then on the flip side of things, if I have too much lean meat and not enough fat, then I won't necessarily crave fat, but I will get hungrier while eating. And that's my signal that I'm not eating enough fat and I need to course correct before I make myself really unhappy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I found a similar approach with myself. I think, your body can tell you pretty quickly if you're not eating enough fat or if you're not eating enough protein. You'll either be, you'll have different forms of hunger basically, or waxing and waning energy levels if you under or over consume either of them, in my experience. And Siobhan, you feed your cat carnivore, is that correct?
Yeah. So I adopted a cat from my sister because the cat hates children and my sister has 3 children. The cat likes me, so she came home with me. And at the start, she had hyperthyroid issues. So I was reading through blog posts of what to feed a hyperthyroid cat because I'm coming from a place where I'll see in a Facebook group I'm in that, someone was hyper or hypothyroid and they went keto or carnivore and now it's all fixed up now. So why not apply the same principles to the cat? And I came across 2 different articles from like legitimate veterinary clinics. And they both said essentially high protein, moderate fat, as low carbohydrate as you can get it, some edible bones, some organs. So I was like, okay, I'll do that. And they're like, I offered her some of what I was eating and she ate like all of it, which was great because I had heard there can be a transition period sometimes, but nope, she was all for it. So I still feed her raw carnivore. She recently fell off the bed and smacked herself in the face, so she's having issues chewing.
Oh no.
So I just give her, usually it's like ground up beef, ground up lamb. Sometimes she'll get a bit of just whole fish because that's soft enough for her to eat. Bone in, the type of bone that's crunchy and crumbles so she can eat it easily. And she's been doing really well. Her mood, like just her mood, has been a huge improvement. She used to be the most temperamental cat, cranky, horrible, and now she's the nicest cat in the world. She doesn't have random mood swings, which I can relate. So she's just been doing really well. She has been grooming herself again. Her fur is looking good. She has energy, but not like an abnormal amount of energy, which is kind of what you look for with hyperthyroid cats. So doing well so far. I did recheck her thyroid levels when she was only like 2 months in and there wasn't a change, but the vet did say that she no longer has a nodule in her thyroid, which apparently used to be there before, and she used to have a heart murmur, and that is gone. So both good things.
Yeah, that's excellent, and great to hear about her recovery. I can't wait to get a dog myself, and I definitely have been doing some research on raw meat diets for dogs. And it just seems like they're so natural, and their moods and their health improve so much that it's almost it is very cruel to feed animals against their will. This high carb, refined, processed food, pet food diet.
Yeah, and I actually have looked at like the ingredients of the dog food and like all that type of stuff, like the treats. It's essentially just candy for dogs. And the most hilarious but also horribly depressing thing to me is that on the veterinary sites that I was reading through, they were like, oh yeah, obesity in cats, that's hyperinsulinemia. Oh yeah, hyperthyroid, that's hyperinsulinemia. Like IBS, that's an improper diet. And then it's like, okay, so you guys get this, but humans? Like,
Yeah.
is there a disconnect here?
Yeah, what's going on?
it's funny, but it's also sad. But it's like we're so close to getting it. We just need to add the two together and we can figure it out.
Yeah, we just need some of these vets to go to some physician conferences and we'll be all set.
Oh, I would love that. There's one in particular. It's Peter of highfatnutrition.blogspot.com, I think. Also called like Hyperlipid. He does like super in-depth articles. He was talking about the same things about lipoprotein(a) that I have been talking about recently, and he was talking about them like back in 2007. And I only heard that he had existed after Low Carb Breckenridge because Michael Eads had mentioned him in his talk, and he's a veterinarian, so it's like, please come and talk and share your wisdom.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Siobhan, this has been really fun and packed full of information that I think folks will find really useful. Where can people find out more about you?
So most of the time, like answering questions and things like that, I'm usually just keeping my eyes like a hawk on the cholesterolcode.com comments. If you have a question, it's best to put it there because I am obligated to answer. Also, I just see it first. I'm also on Twitter at Siobhan_Huggins, which I hope you'll link because nobody's going to be able to spell that.
Yes.
And I'm also on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. The Instagram is at RightHandSiobhan.
Great. Well, I'll definitely link all of those in the show notes. And thanks so much again for your time, Siobhan. It's been really fun.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for having me on.
Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered? Or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.